You've returned, how wonderful. Before the mist rises again over ancient hills, please remember to tap the like button, subscribe, and share this with someone who sleeps best wrapped in history. Dim the lights, sink back into your pillow, close your eyes, or let them blur on the screen. This is your quiet time. And this evening, we trace the stories hidden in Celtic stone circles and long-forgotten rituals. Welcome to Episode 3. We looked at Celtic religion and spent considerable time on the Druids, who were active in various parts of the Celtic-speaking world, including Britain. In this year, we'll concentrate on Britain. First, we'll examine the question of whether the inhabitants of Britain can be called Celts, and if so, in what sense. And then we'll look at what life was like for the people of Britain, both before and after Britain was occupied by Rome. So let's start with an important question. Were the Britons Celts? It used to be easy to answer this question. Of course they were Celts. The earliest proper names we have from Britain are definitely in a Celtic language. By the time of the first Roman invasion in the 1st century BC, they were producing objects in the Latin style of art. If they were speaking Celtic and producing Celtic art, they were Celts. End of story. So let's assume for just a minute that these people are Celts. We'll come back to the question of whether they were or were not Celts a bit later. So we assume they're Celts. How do we get Celts in Britain? The old model for the Celts would have said that Britain became Celtic through invasion. Celtic warriors from Central Europe brought the total Celtic package with them. Language, art, culture, the cult of the severed head, the whole thing. But there are some problems with the evidence. The first and most obvious problem is the point I've made before, which is that no ancient author calls the inhabitants of Britain Celts. They did call people on the continent Celts, but not the people of Britain. Another problem comes with the linguistic evidence. I mentioned earlier when talking about the Celtic languages that we have two major groups of Celtic languages today, Brittonic and Goidelic, corresponding roughly to the languages spoken in Britain and the languages spoken in Ireland. And this division within the Celtic language family poses a problem for the invasion model. Modern linguists mostly believe that the Goidelic branch of Celtic developed earlier than the Brittonic branch. If that's the case, how do you work out the timing of a Celtic invasion of the British Isles and Ireland? Well, there's an obvious answer, though it's probably not the right one. Scholars came up with an ingenious way to explain the fact that you have these fairly distinct language subfamilies showing up in a relatively small geographical area, Ireland and Britain. The idea was that instead of one Celtic invasion of Britain and Ireland, we really need to think of two Celtic invasions. First, you have an original group of Goidelic-speaking invaders who come to Britain and then proceed all the way to Ireland, and then a new wave of Brittonic speakers. They follow and conquer Britain, but don't make it all the way to Ireland. So the main point is that the Celtic language comes into Britain, according to this model, with an influx of new people. But the two invasion model seems a little too complicated to be plausible. Plus, there are problems with the archaeological evidence. We don't have evidence for large-scale movements of people. Usually, when you have a big population movement, you see a lot of basic aspects of life shifting accordingly. Things like the style of house that is being built, or the kinds of animals being raised, or the kinds of crops that are being grown. You don't see that in Britain. Instead, you see a lot of continuity down through the Iron Age, right through to the Roman invasions, into the 1st centuries BC and AD. So we have three objections so far to the invasion hypothesis. One based on the lack of written evidence for the Britons being called Celts, one based on linguistic evidence, and one based on archaeological evidence. We have a fourth kind of objection to the idea of a Celtic invasion, and it comes from a very modern technique, the study of DNA. If the invasion hypothesis is true, then we ought to be able to see a connection in the DNA of modern British people with the DNA of Central Europeans around the areas of Hallstatt and Laten. But recent studies have shown that the inhabitants of Britain are not closely related to the inhabitants of Central Europe. So if the Celts were from the Hallstatt-Laten region, they were not the ones who invaded Britain. But if you don't see evidence of people coming from Central Europe to Britain, you do see the arrival in Britain of Latin-style art. For example, we have a wonderful object called the Wandsworth Shield, dating from the 2nd century BC, which was found in the River Thames in the 19th century. It may have been one of the votive offerings of weapons that were extremely common in this period. It is very strongly marked by the spiral designs that are so characteristic of the Latin style. And we could multiply the examples. So how did this happen? In recent years, scholars have replaced the invasion hypothesis with a different model altogether. They now believe in a process of Celticization by diffusion rather than invasion. It's the idea I mentioned in an earlier lecture that this art style became a very popular fad. There were apparently many aspects of Celtic culture that appealed to the peoples of Britain, and they slowly adopted them, including the language. So we have two models, and a scholar named Lisa Bond has come up with a very evocative way to distinguish them. She calls the invasion model the diaspora model, and she calls the diffusion model the meme model. What do these two terms mean? The diaspora model is fairly obvious. Of course, this is the idea that art styles spread with the people as the people spread out from an original homeland. We might think of diasporas that we are familiar with, such as the Jewish diaspora or the African diaspora, where certain aspects of a people's culture travel with them. The diaspora model just might allow us to get away with the fact that we have no evidence for a kind of destructive influx of people. Maybe it was peaceful settlement, but still it was a genuine movement of substantial numbers of people. The meme model is completely different. Instead of the people bringing the art style with them, the art style spreads without people moving from place to place, kind of like a meme spreads today on the internet without any of the people involved migrating at all. But there is no internet in the late Iron Age, so how does an Iron Age meme spread? People have to be involved somehow. One possible mechanism for how this happened is through trade. Britain was a major center of metals, particularly tin, copper, and iron, especially from Cornwall and Wales. We know that the Phoenicians in the early 1st millennium BC bought tin from Britain. Tin is a crucial component in bronze, and it was well known throughout the Mediterranean that Britain was where you went for tin. Archaeologists have uncovered the remains of Iron Age tin mining, which was sort of like panning for gold, except you artificially create a stream that separates the heavier tin from the lighter sandy soil that has settled above it. This is called tin streaming. And this trade in metals probably created a kind of merchant elite all along the Atlantic coast of Europe. These areas were Celtic speaking, as we know, and it may be that Celtic speech and certain aspects of Celtic culture made their way to Britain by this route. The art may have taken a different route directly from Central Europe, and remember, the art barely made it to Spain. So you get a fusion in Britain of Celtic speech with Latin art, both of which were probably associated with high status, and then the language spread. This is not as weird a notion as it sounds. It turns out that a very similar process of language change happened in Britain later on with the arrival of the Angles and Saxons. So we have two models for Celticizing Britain. The diaspora model is simple. People called Celts bring Celticness with them, the whole toolkit: Celtic languages, Celtic art, Celtic culture. The meme model is messier. Somehow, for some reason, possibly due to trade, people in Britain started speaking Celtic languages, and they also adopted a distinctive art style. But these two elements of culture, language and art, might have actually reached Britain from two different directions. So are we entitled to call the inhabitants of Britain Celts? I think we are, as long as we know what we mean by the term. We are calling them Celts because they spoke a Celtic language. And while there are a lot of scholars who expend a lot of energy trying to stop people from calling the Britons Celts, It is such an ingrained habit by now that it isn't worth getting too worried about. That is enough models and theories for now. I'll talk a little bit now about what Britain was like before the Roman conquest, and then say something about how Britain fared under Roman rule. The important thing to grasp about Britain in the Iron Age is that it was not politically united. Pre-Roman Britain was divided among many tribes. If you look at a map of Britain in this period, you can see that there are quite a few tribal groupings. Some of these tribal confederations were quite dominant in their respective regions. Sometimes these tribes allied with each other, and other times they fought against each other. But this was a fairly prosperous society with elites that became wealthy, especially in the south and east, which had much richer agricultural lands. And these British tribes were not isolated from the continent, by no means. The tribes in southeastern Britain adopted some of the traits of the more materially advanced cultures on the continent, including coinage. The startling thing is that if you look at a map of the tribes that adopted coinage, you are almost looking at a forecast of the political map of Britain in the 20th century, with a south and east much more oriented toward Europe, and a north and west that is much more insular in orientation. The modern world is not so far from the Iron Age after all. This was a diverse society with various forms of political organization. Some of these tribes, but by no means all, built impressive hill forts, somewhat similar to the ones we see on the continent. A map of Iron Age hill forts in Britain reveals a very uneven distribution pattern across the island, with concentrations in the north, in Wales, and in the southwest. The most famous surviving example is at Maiden Castle in Dorset. The material culture is also not uniform throughout the island, and this is yet another reason why modern scholars are uncomfortable calling it Celtic Britain, because that tends to minimize the importance of regional variations. Enter our old friend Caesar. In 55 BC, while Caesar was in the midst of his campaigns in Gaul, he led an expedition to Britain, but it wasn't very successful, so he came back the next year with a greater number of soldiers and managed to get some local British tribes to promise submission to Rome. Then Caesar left. Really, there wasn't much more to it than that. This British adventure of Caesar's was mostly just an offshoot of the campaign in Gaul. Caesar seems to have been drawn to Britain partly because he thought some of the tribes there might have been giving aid and comfort to his enemies in Gaul. Some of the British tribes may in fact have had family connections to Gaul, and as we have seen, they certainly had very close economic ties to Gaul. Another reason may also have been that Caesar had heard rather exaggerated stories about the potential riches to be found in Britain. Maybe there was lots of gold and silver there. Of course, this didn't turn out to be true, and that may be one reason why Caesar didn't bother to put more of an effort into conquering Britain. But the most important reason he didn't stick around was that he had all he could handle just subduing Gaul, and then he was off back to Rome to start a civil war. Caesar's little British escapade had really been his own project, part of his private effort to secure riches and fame. It wasn't really official Roman policy at all, so nothing much more happened between Rome and Britain for about a century. In that century, of course, a lot had changed for Rome. The Roman Republic had fallen, largely due to Caesar's own actions, and Rome was now led by an emperor. The imperial administration had grown much more elaborate. The second time Rome encountered Britain, it was going to be much more of an official enterprise. It all started in 43 AD under the Emperor Claudius, who was portrayed very memorably by Sir Derek Jacobi in the wonderful television series I, Claudius. Claudius decided he wanted some sort of military triumph to boast about, and Britain was one of the last feasible places the Romans could conquer. But unlike Julius Caesar, Claudius was no general. He had his soldiers plan and carry out the campaign with a much larger number of men than Julius Caesar had had. Claudius basically showed up at the end to take the credit. This time, though, the Romans were planning to stay. they made arrangements to collect tribute from a lot of the British tribes, particularly in the south and east. Over the course of the next 20 years or so, they established legions at several important strongholds in Britain, including Londinium, which of course became London, and Eboracum, which became York. So they established fortified sites throughout the country, and naturally the Romans connected them to each other with their famous Roman roads. Now, the Romans were quite happy to work with what they found in Britain. The native inhabitants had already figured out the best routes across the country based on the terrain. So a lot of times, the new Roman roads were based on existing native British trackways. But the big contribution of the Romans was that they paved the roads and made them straighter. Some of these roads are still quite important in English life today. The Roman engineers were so good that when later engineers needed to plan the modern motorways, they often just used the routes of the Roman roads. Watling Street, for example, a great road that led northwest from Dover to London and then from London to Wroxeter, gave us the route for the A2 and A5 motorways. So many English workers today can thank the Romans for their daily commute. So the Romans were busily turning Britain into a typical Roman province. The British tribes responded in various ways to Roman rule. Some of the tribes, particularly the ones in the south and east who had already had a lot of contact with the Roman province of Gaul, were actually quite happy to collaborate with the new Roman regime. In fact, in about 50 AD, the queen of the Brigantes tribe, Cartimandua, actually helped the Romans to suppress the resistance of the Catavillani tribe by turning over their leader, Caractacus, to the Roman authorities. Incidentally, Cartimandua had a rather colorful career. In 69 AD, she got tired of her first husband, Venutius, and divorced him in order to marry her armor-bearer, Velicatus. This did not sit well with Venutius or with the rest of the Brigantes, and Venutius put together an anti-Roman faction that overthrew Cartimandua, and she had to call in the Romans to restore her to the throne. There was a second rebellion after that, and this time the Romans were not able to put Cartimandua back on the throne. All they could do was save her life. It took until 74 AD for the Brigantes to be subdued for good. And the rebellious Brigantes were by no means alone in resenting Roman rule. As I said, some tribes had entered into agreements with the Romans, but not all. One tribe in particular, the Iceni of eastern England, broke out into a terrifying rebellion in 60 AD, and this rebellion nearly swept the Romans out of Britain. What happened was this. The king of the Iceni, Prasutagus, had died without any sons, leaving only his widow, Queen Boudica, and 2 daughters. The Roman authorities decided to incorporate the kingdom into the administration of the province. But apparently, some of the local Roman officials overreached themselves when they were sent to carry out this annexation. Roman soldiers ended up flogging Queen Boudica and raping her daughters. This was a seriously bad move. Boudica rose in revolt and carried many of the other southern British tribes with her. According to the classical historian Cassius Dio, Boudica rallied the Celtic tribes while wearing a torque, which was a characteristic Celtic symbol of authority. This sort of torque has been found in Britain, for example at Snettisham in Norfolk, which was ruled by the Iceni. Some people like to speculate that this is actually Boudica's own torque, but that would probably be too good to be true. The Iceni and their allies seemed determined to erase all sign of the Romans in Britain. They killed Romans and burned their settlements, and they even managed to burn Londinium. To this day, if you dig down under London, you can find the layer of ash that is left from the huge fire that burned at the time of the revolt. They then proceeded north to Verulamium and beyond. They met the main Roman force in the Midlands, but they were decisively defeated. The Roman historian Tacitus tells us that Boudica took poison to avoid capture, surely in order to escape the traditional fate of the enemies of Rome, where they're paraded in a Roman triumph, like the Gaulish chieftain Vercingetorix a century before. Boudica became very popular in the 19th century as an exemplar of British fighting spirit. For some reason, Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, was a big fan of Boudica. In 1902, a massive statue of Boudica was erected on the Thames embankment, so residents of London today can spend some time with the woman who burned the city to the ground and nearly drove the Romans from the island of Britain. But the Romans prevailed, and they re-established control in the southern part of the island. Still, it had been a close-run thing. The Roman authorities had clearly been spooked, and one of the decisions they made over the next couple of decades was to concentrate their efforts in Britain in the south and east, where they had had the most success thus far. The Romans did mount a major campaign into the north of Britain in 83 AD, under the leadership of the Roman governor, a general named Agricola, who was fortunate enough to have a son-in-law named Tacitus, who was a pretty good historian. The Romans had been trying for many years to bring the northern British tribe known as the Caledonians to battle, but the Caledonians wisely declined to fight the Romans, who were much better armed and also much better disciplined. Instead, the Caledonians would appear and disappear, never quite providing a target that the Romans could strike at. Finally, the Romans did bring the Caledonians to battle by marching north into Caledonian territory just as the harvest was being brought in, and the Romans went straight for the granaries. The Caledonians had to fight or starve. The Romans and Caledonians fought a major battle at a site known as Mons Graupius, somewhere in what is now Scotland, but the location of the battle has never been positively identified. It was apparently a complete rout. Tacitus tells us that 10,000 Caledonian soldiers were killed, while on the Roman side, only 360 auxiliary troops died. The Romans had not even had to deploy their main legionary forces. Rome seemed poised to bring all of the island of Britain under its direct control. But it was not to be. Agricola was recalled to Rome, given a triumph, and sent to rule another province elsewhere in the empire. Tacitus implies that Rome had conquered all of Britain, only to let it slip from her grasp. Under Emperor Hadrian in the early 2nd century, the Romans built a wall clear across what is now northern England, from the mouth of the Tyne River in the east to the mouth of the Solway Firth in the west, to mark off the territory they were prepared to defend. To the south of the wall was civilized territory. To the north, there were barbarian tribes, people who painted themselves blue and fought naked, people the Romans were just as happy not to mess with. And they found out why they shouldn't mess with these people by trying to build a wall a little further north a few decades after Hadrian's Wall. This was the Antonine Wall, which ran from the Firth of Forth in the east, near what is now Edinburgh, to the Firth of Clyde in the west, near what is now Glasgow. The Antonine Wall proved to be too far north, and the Romans basically had to abandon it. Hadrian's Wall became the limes, or boundary of the Roman Empire. That's where we get our word limit from, the Latin word limes. Beyond the wall were the Picts. I'll talk about them later. They were reasonably scary, so the Romans elected not to try to conquer them. Now let's look for a moment at where things stand in the mid-2nd century or so. Britain is already divided into a larger southern portion that the Romans were willing to defend, and a smaller northern portion that they're not interested in defending. This geographic distinction roughly foreshadows the later division on the island of Britain between England in the south and Scotland in the north. But even in the south, the colonized area, the Roman province of Britain fell into two broad zones. First, there was the southern and eastern part of the province. This was the area with the most fertile agricultural land, largely in the form of broad plains. It was the easiest for the Romans to conquer. By the 2nd century, there were about 40 major urban centers established in this part of Britain, including the forerunners of the modern cities of Leeds, Lincoln, Newcastle, Exeter, and many others, all connected up by those famous Roman roads. This area was certainly Romanized to the extent that the towns had the usual Roman buildings and other trappings, a forum, an amphitheater, that sort of thing. There were also quite a few large Roman villas in the south. These were huge estates that probably employed many slaves. So that part of Britain, the south and east, looked fairly Roman, at least if you focused on the towns and the large villas. But there was another zone to the north and west that looked quite different. Here the landscape was hilly and rocky, and it was much harder to set up the kinds of settlements the Romans were used to. Also, the local tribes were less cooperative, so the Roman military presence in these areas, especially what is now Wales, Cornwall, and the northwest, had to be much stronger. Here there were more fortresses staffed by Roman legions. They were mostly pretty successful at preventing serious revolts, but there was certainly no chance that they would be able to hold the province if the soldiers weren't there. So what was the impact on the native British, the Celtic speakers who had been conquered by the Romans? Picture is an interesting mix. Some things stayed the same, other things changed, and the degree of change depended on where you were. In the cities, the language of daily life, certainly of commerce, was Latin, and all the main cultural trends in the life of the Roman Empire eventually made their way to Britain. Artistic styles, styles of dress, etc., even religion. From about the 3rd century, Christianity appeared in Britain and got a secure foothold in the towns. Of course, it had plenty of competition. There were dozens of other cults being practiced in the British towns, just like in all the other Roman cities. In fact, Roman Britain could boast a ritual center that was famous enough to draw pilgrims from other parts of the empire, namely Aquae Sulis. This was a town in the west of Britain that had wonderful hot springs. The native British population had used the site to venerate their goddess Sulis. The Romans were a broad-minded sort of imperial people. They liked to take over and adopt the gods of the people they conquered. So the Romans figured that this goddess Sulis was close enough to their own goddess Minerva, the goddess of wisdom, so they worshipped a composite goddess, Sulis Minerva. This, of course, allowed them to take advantage of the fantastic hot springs at the shrine of Sulis. Of course, these springs later gave us our name for the city concerned, Bath. Some of the best ruins in Britain today can be found at Bath, where the elaborate pools and temple complexes have been beautifully excavated. They are well worth a visit. The people who left ritual offerings at Bath present a good cross-section of the Romanized British population. There were some very rich objects, doubtless left by people who lived in the very fancy villas that I mentioned. But there were also some very humble objects like coins of small value that were clearly left by the poorer inhabitants. The vast majority of the people who lived in Roman Britain were, of course, farmers who lived on very simple farms, raising crops to consume themselves with maybe a little left over for the market. In the countryside, the Latin language probably did not penetrate very far. These rural inhabitants probably spoke little if any Latin. Their language was British, and we have lots and lots of surviving place names that come from the British language, so it's clear that British continued to be spoken. Far fewer of these country dwellers would have adopted Christianity. Many would have continued to follow their pagan gods throughout the period of Roman occupation. And their field patterns stayed the same too throughout the Roman period and beyond. However, these British inhabitants were Romanized in a very important sense. They used a lot of Roman stuff. Archaeologists have found evidence of lots of very basic Roman-style goods among these native inhabitants. Things like pottery that had been mass-produced, glassware, and iron nails for building. The diet of these Celtic-speaking inhabitants also changed as a result of the Roman presence in Britain. They began growing and eating fruits originally brought in from Italy, such as apples. One other way we can see the penetration of Romanness into everyday life in Britain is from finding lots and lots of Roman coins in small denominations, even on quite rural sites. The economy was clearly becoming more monetized, so even very low-level exchanges were now taking place by means of money rather than barter. But there was something behind this increase in monetary circulation other than pure market forces, namely taxation. The Roman state needed huge amounts of money to pay for its military infrastructure, a large portion of which was spent in Britain. These taxes were collected throughout the empire and then, in many cases, spent locally to pay the Roman military garrisons and provide them with food and other supplies. So ironically, the Roman occupation was a huge stimulus to the British economy. Thus, Rome had changed life in Britain in some important ways, especially with regard to the economy and material life in general. But the people of Britain had maintained many aspects of their native traditions as well, including their language. In a later lecture, we'll look at what happened to this Romanized but Celtic-speaking culture in the 5th century, when Rome withdrew its military support, and some very powerful newcomers arrived on the scene. In our last lecture, we looked at Britain both before and after Roman occupation, but we concentrated mostly on the areas that the Romans conquered, especially the areas that were the most heavily influenced by Roman culture, primarily in the south and east. Today, we're going to talk about what's going on in northern Britain, the area that never fully came under Roman control. Of course, we'll spend a lot of time looking at the Picts. We're going to look at where the Picts come from and how they fit into the picture of a Celtic-speaking island of Britain. But we'll also see that the Picts are just one piece of the puzzle of what was happening north of Hadrian's Wall. They did not rule all of what would later be Scotland, by no means. They had to share northern Britain with many other groups of people, though they were not as different from their neighbors as people used to think they were. At the time of the Roman invasion, Scotland was inhabited by various tribes, including the people later known as Picts, who probably spoke a form of Brittonic Celtic related to Welsh. Only over the course of subsequent centuries did the Picts diverge from the other tribes of northern Britain and forge a distinctive identity. We should start by saying something about the name Pict. The name was not in use at the time the Romans first arrived in Britain. In fact, we do know something about the geographical terms that were used in those early centuries. In the 2nd century AD, a man named Ptolemy created a geographical description of the Roman Empire called the Cosmographia. Ptolemy provides tribal names for many areas in the empire, but he also includes information about places like Ireland and northern Britain which were not under Roman control. We can use Ptolemy's text to track the tribal names for the whole island of Britain. In the north, Ptolemy placed the Caledoniae, probably the best-known tribe in northern Britain. They give us the modern term Caledonia, which is used as a synonym for Scotland. In the north, you also have the Damnoniae and the Cornaviae, both of whom may have had links to tribes in the south. But you don't have anybody called the Picts. Now, Ptolemy didn't get everything right. Renaissance scholars who tried to use his description to make actual maps depicted Scotland with a kind of L-shaped protrusion that stuck out to the east. But the point seems clear. Nobody in the 2nd century had ever heard of Picts. They were not called the Picts until the late 3rd century, when a crisis in the Roman Empire led a bunch of Roman authors to start calling attention to various groups of barbarians on the Roman frontiers, including the area north of Hadrian's Wall. These authors wrote panegyrics or praise poems about various Roman emperors and their accomplishments. One of these texts gives us our first mention of the term Picts, whom it describes as half-naked savages. And this was a period when the Romans faced quite a few enemies. By the early 4th century, there was a Roman catalog of barbarian groups called the Verona List that listed 53 nations on the borders of the empire that the Romans had to deal with. And this text has a great subtitle, so I'm going to give it to you in Latin first and then translate it. It's called the Gentes Barbarae quae pullulaverunt sub imperatoribus, or the barbarian nations that sprang up under the emperors. So the title of the text is sort of blaming the emperors for letting these barbarian peoples arise on their watch. Now that might not be entirely fair, but the text kind of gets it right when it makes the Romans themselves responsible for the creation of the Picts. in two ways. First, much more than with the Celts, the Romans possibly helped to invent the term Picts. There were never any people who went around, as we know of, calling themselves the Picts. It's even more of a problem than with the Celts, where at least there were some people on the continent who called themselves Celts. With the Picts, it was really the Romans who called them that. So if you asked a guy with tattoos of the 3rd century if he was a Pict, he would have no idea what you were talking about, unless he read a lot of Latin panegyrics, which is not likely. But there's also a second way in which the Romans invented the Picts, and this goes beyond terminology. The group of tribes north of Hadrian's Wall that came to be known as the Picts were basically similar to the Britons who lived south of Hadrian's Wall. It's just that they were not Romanized. By the late 3rd century, when we first start to hear the term Picti or Picts, which in Latin means painted ones, the two areas of Britain have diverged. The Britons south of the wall have adopted Roman customs and presumably are wearing more clothes and fewer tattoos. The people north of the wall have not gotten the memo about clothes. By the way, this association of nakedness with savagery would be a huge part of the cultural conflict between the English and the Irish in subsequent centuries. So why did the Romans call these people the Painted Ones? Did the Picts in fact paint themselves blue like Mel Gibson in Braveheart? One thing we know for sure is that Sir William Wallace did not paint himself blue, but the producers of Braveheart were very aware of how widespread the idea is that the Picts painted themselves blue, and the fact that William Wallace was around 1,000 years later than the Picts, that was not going to stop them from going with an arresting visual. So where do we get the idea that the Picts painted themselves blue? Well, Julius Caesar tells us that the Celts supposedly got blue pigment from the woad plant, and that they used it to decorate their bodies. There are actually no specific accounts of woad being used in Scotland to paint human skin. People have tested woad, and it's much better at dyeing cloth than skin. In fact, woad was widely used in the Middle Ages for all kinds of cloth, including some surviving tapestries. There are actually a number of first-hand accounts from people who have tried to test woad on themselves. And it apparently not only does not leave a blue tattoo, it really burns the skin. Oh well. It has even been theorized that the real use of woad was for helping scars to heal after battle. The long and the short of it is that we don't know if the Picts painted themselves blue, but if they did, they certainly did not look like Mel Gibson. But obviously, the Romans were upset about something. The Picts were a military threat to Roman Britain, and in 367 to 368 AD, and at a few other times, they seem to have allied with groups of people coming from Ireland, who may have constituted the later Irish kingdom of Dalriata that straddled the sea between northeastern Ireland and southwestern Scotland. This so-called barbarian conspiracy started off a war that lasted on and off well into the 5th century, and at one point, the Picts and their allies had established temporary control of the Roman province of Britain. This was a sophisticated strategic effort that has to have required extensive knowledge of Roman defenses. So much for the Picts as naked savages. Furthermore, the revolt proved that the Britons were quite willing to be overrun by their northern compatriots, for such they were. Britain was always a problematic province, and the Picts were very much part of the landscape. Still, as we saw in our last lecture, Roman Britain survived as a Christianized province well into the 5th century. It was probably from somewhere in the northern part of the province of Britain, that is, south of Hadrian's Wall but still pretty far north, that St. Patrick was captured as a slave and taken to the north of Ireland. I should stress, though, that we really don't know where St. Patrick came from. Some people place him very far north indeed, in fact, all the way north by the Antonine Wall. Others put him quite far south, all the way in Somerset on the south coast. Others hedge their bets and just put him somewhere in Britain. Let's just say that northern Britain is as close as we're going to come. And if we don't know where he was born, then the question of when he was born is just as bad. He was active in Ireland roughly in the middle third of the 5th century, so all we can do is speculate that he was born maybe in the late 4th century, so he was probably a witness to the Pictish Wars that I've just been talking about. I'll have more to say about St. Patrick when we focus on Ireland in a later lecture, but for now it's interesting to see what he can tell us about northern Britain. And the reason St. Patrick matters to us is that he had an important confrontation with people who may have come under the general heading of Picts, or at least of northern unromanized Britons. As many people know, St. Patrick served as a slave in the north of Ireland for 6 years, during which time he underwent a religious conversion. He had been raised as a Christian, but a fairly lukewarm Christian, apparently. But then, the experience of captivity gave him time to pray and reflect, and he felt the call to evangelize the Irish. So after his escape, he studied for the priesthood and returned to Ireland to preach the gospel. It was at some point during his mission that he came up against Caradocus, a British or Pictish warlord from southwestern Scotland, who had carried out a massive slave raid in Northern Ireland, kind of the reverse of the raid that had captured Patrick many years before. And this is a good indication of the unsettled times Patrick lived in. The thing that really bothered Patrick was that many of the victims of this slave raid were newly baptized converts. Caradocus had stolen away the fruits of St. Patrick's missionary labors. So what can St. Patrick do about this? He writes a letter to Caradocus demanding that these captives be released. In the letter, St. Patrick very ostentatiously refuses to call Caradocus a fellow Roman, which is interesting, because St. Patrick seems to think that this is a very effective put-down, which shows us that Romanness was still seen as an appealing attribute in the 5th century. It's also an insult to withhold the designation of Roman, because by this point the Roman label carried with it an assumption that the person so labeled was also a Christian. And in fact, Caradocus was at least nominally a Christian. The northern Britons had been evangelized starting in the late 4th century, which is what made the participation of Caradocus in the slave trade so heinous in St. Patrick's eyes. The letter was intended to shame Caradocus publicly. Here is what Patrick has to say about him. So where will Caradocus and his villainous rebels against Christ find themselves? Those who divide out defenseless baptized women as prizes, all for the sake of a miserable temporal kingdom which will pass away in a moment of time. Just as a cloud of smoke is blown away by the wind, that is how deceitful sinners will perish from the face of the Lord. The just, however, will banquet in great constancy with Christ. They will judge nations and will rule over evil kings for all ages. Amen. This was the early medieval equivalent of flaming someone online. Unfortunately, we have no indication that the captives of Caradocus were ever released. The picture we get from this incident of political chaos in northern Britain and Northern Ireland is probably pretty accurate. If you look at a map of what northern Britain probably looked like in this period, you get a sense of what modern historians are up against in reconstructing what was going on here. We don't see a kingdom called Pictland. Instead, we see a number of tribal confederations, much as we saw in Britain when the Romans first arrived. These tribal confederations fall into two rough categories. Some of them belong in the Pictish category, but historians classify other tribal groupings as British, such as the Kingdom of Gododin or Godovin, which we'll talk about shortly. Now, what on earth is the difference between Pictish and British? Well, you might ask. Part of the difference could be language, which I'll talk about more in a minute. But there may have been other cultural and political forces at work that slowly drove the inhabitants of northern Britain to line up in two distinct ethnic groupings, despite the fact that they were originally very similar to each other. The origins of this division are obscure, But by the period of the Roman withdrawal from Britain, it was becoming clear that in the northern part of the island there were two main power blocks. So in the territory that would later be Scotland, you have some peoples who are Pictish and other peoples who are British. But even within these two main categories, you don't have political unity. There is not one single Pictish kingdom going up against a single British kingdom. To add to this complicated picture, you have newcomers to northern Britain coming in from two directions. Starting largely in the 5th century, you have Irish settlers in the north and west, particularly in the islands off the west coast of Scotland. In fact, these Irish settlers were known as the Scoti, so much later they gave their name to the people of Scotland. It's confusing for sure that Scotland is named after an Irish tribe, but we just have to live with it. We're just going to call them the Irish from now on. So these Irish settlers were coming into northern Britain from the Kingdom of Dalriata in the north of Ireland and creating a kind of political entity that existed on both sides of the water. So in those areas, in the north and west, the language being spoken was increasingly Irish. But there were also people coming into northern Britain from the south and east. Around 500 or so, groups of Germanic-speaking peoples called Angles began colonizing northern Britain. The Angles gave us the first element in the term Anglo-Saxon. They started pushing fairly far north into what is now Scotland, and they, of course, spoke a language that is related to our modern English language. Their advance into the lowlands of Scotland all the way back in this period is the main reason the Scots speak English today. There is a distinct dialect or language called Scots, but it is extremely closely related to English. So now you have even more linguistic and ethnic diversity. By around 600 or so in the area we think of now as Scotland, at least 4 languages were being spoken, 3 of which were Celtic. The 3 Celtic languages were British and Pictish, which may have been closely related, but they were seen as different from each other by people at the time. And then you have Irish, which is related to British and Pictish, but much more distantly. Finally, there was the language of the Angles, which we could roughly call English, which is a Germanic language quite different from the Celtic languages. You could also add a 5th language, namely Latin, which is the language of the Christian Church. Christianity was making great inroads in this period, especially in the British-speaking areas of what is now southwestern Scotland. But let's return for a moment to the Picts. There are many unresolved questions about the Picts. We're not sure, for instance, whether the Picts lived only in Scotland or whether there were Picts in Northern Ireland as well. There are hints that there may have been Picts in Ireland at around this time, because there are signs that there was a people in Ireland, especially in the north, who were regarded by the Irish as ethnically distinct from them. These people were called the Cruithin. Now, the term Cruithin is etymologically equivalent to a word that is used to describe the Picts, with one interesting and perhaps telling difference. At the beginning of the word where you would expect a P, you get a C, so Cruithin rather than Pruthin or some such form. This is exactly the difference between the Q Celtic languages and the P Celtic languages that we talked about in an earlier lecture. So the Cruithin in Northern Ireland may very well be the cousins of the Picts in Scotland. Now, not all scholars are convinced that there was a genuine ethnic connection between the two peoples. But the bottom line, I think, is that we should see the boundaries at this period as very fluid. The sea is more of a highway than a barrier, and there is a lot of traffic across the Irish Sea. But northern Britain is also very strongly connected to the rest of the island of Britain. It is not cut off by Hadrian's Wall, either before or after the Romans withdrew their legions, and the connection between northern Britain and the south also survived the Anglo-Saxon conquests that I'll talk about in a future lecture. Just as the very famous figure of St. Patrick can exemplify the ties between northern Britain and Ireland, so another famous figure can tell us something about how northern Britain is tied to southern Britain, namely King Arthur. There is a very early poem in Welsh called the Gododdin that takes place in what is now Scotland, and it's probably most famous today because it contains the first mention of a warrior named Arthur. It takes place around 600, during the period when the Angles were pushing north into what had been British territory in southeastern Scotland. The poem depicts a raid by the men of the British Kingdom of Gododdin on the Anglian fortress of Cartwright, which ended in a disastrous defeat for the Britons. Now, the poem was about the north, but we only have it because it was preserved in a manuscript far to the south in Wales. Ultimately, British speech disappeared in Scotland. It was squeezed out in the southeast by the Angles and in the west by the Irish, and ultimately British was replaced everywhere on the island of Britain except in Wales and Cornwall. British was the ancestor of both Welsh and Cornish. But in Wales, they clung to the memory of a time when people who spoke their language had ruled in the north. The Welsh refer to this period as Yr Hen Ogledd, or the Old North. I think it's quite poignant that the Welsh preserved this memory of former greatness. The story of the Celts is full of this kind of nostalgia. So what does this poem actually say about Arthur? It's a very cryptic reference, but we can get something out of it, I think. The poem praises one of the warriors of the Gododdin, a man named Gwyrddir, for his mighty deeds in the raid on the Anglian fortress of Cartwright. Here's how it reads. He fed black ravens on the rampart of a fortress, though he was no Arthur. So what does it mean that he fed black ravens on the rampart? It means that he killed a lot of guys who became food for the ravens. But there's a sting in it. Yeah, pretty good, but not as good as Arthur. This is actually our earliest reference to someone named Arthur having a huge military reputation. Arthur is clearly the gold standard against which this other guy, Gwyrddir, is being measured. I'll say much more about the story of Arthur in a future lecture, but for now I just wanted to make the point that this one little reference to Arthur can show us how connected the whole island of Britain remained, even in a period of tremendous political change and upheaval. But now back to the Picts. If the story of the British in the north is largely one of retrenchment and defeat as the areas of British speech were slowly squeezed out, then the story of the Picts is very different. With the Picts, we see political consolidation, even what we might call triumph, at least for a few brief but glorious centuries. Before we tell the story of the rise of the Pictish kingdom, I want to fulfill my promise to say more about the Pictish language, where exactly it was spoken, and where it came from in the first place. Both of these questions are hard to answer. We don't know as much as we would like to about Pictish, because we have only a few inscriptions to go on, and these tend to be concentrated in the north and east of what is now Scotland. So we imagine that that was the heart of Pictish-speaking territory. But we can't be sure of that, since we don't have inscriptions from the rest of Scotland in other languages at this time, so we might be seeing a distribution of inscriptions rather than a distribution of a language. What we may be seeing is that the area of inscriptions corresponds to the area where a Pictish dynasty was able to establish political control. More about that in a minute. But this could understate the amount of territory where Pictish was the main language of the people. So if you look at a supposed map of where Pictish was spoken, take it with a grain of salt. We're not really all that sure. But the question of where exactly Pictish was spoken has been less controversial than the question of where it comes from. There have been various theories about the origins of Pictish, and keep in mind that all of these theories have to be based on a very small number of words, largely personal names, which is not at all ideal for trying to reconstruct a language. One theory suggested that Pictish was related to Irish, while another suggested it might even be related to English. These theories have been discounted by modern linguists. They just don't hold up to linguistic scrutiny. The weirdest theory, but potentially the most intriguing one, is that Pictish might be a pre-Indo-European language that had somehow survived the supposed arrival of the Celts in northern Britain. This theory has the merit of making the Pict seem incredibly cool, like some sort of special remnant of a very deep prehistoric past. But it's just not true. Linguists and historians have now pretty much agreed that Pictish is a Celtic language closely related to Gaulish, though they're not exactly sure how distinct it was from British, and they can't be sure whether it became distinct from British while both languages were evolving on the island of Britain, or if the two languages, Pictish and British, made their way to Britain independently. Thus, we're back to the question we discussed in a previous lecture of how the Celtic languages got to Britain in the first place. Unfortunately, in the state of our current knowledge, we really can't be sure. If you were to try to draw a map of the languages of northern Britain in, say, 600 AD, it's hard to say whether you would want a very hard and fast line between Pictish and British, or whether it would be more of a continuum than a hard and fast line. But at any rate, Pictish was perceived as a separate language by observers at the time, and since it died out in the 10th or 11th century, we will never be able to test the proposition thoroughly. The reason we understand this linguistic relationship at all is because we do have some inscriptions, as I've said. Some Pictish inscriptions use the Latin alphabet, but other inscriptions use a totally different system of writing called Ogham. Ogham probably comes from Ireland, where it is fairly widespread from the 4th to the 6th centuries, but you also see it in various parts of western Britain and in Scotland. It's a system of writing that uses a center line as the base, and then lines come out from the center line to form the various letters. It's sort of like an early medieval barcode. Irish Ogham typically uses the edge of a standing stone as the center line, whereas Pictish Ogham often has a line cut into the face of the stone. Now, most of these stones are memorial markers of some kind. We get mostly personal names, X son of Y, etc. But these inscriptions have provided enough evidence to help settle the language question we've been talking about, in favor of Pictish being a P-Celtic language very similar to British. There is one more mystery about the Picts that we really don't have a solution to. That is the meaning of the so-called Pictish picture stones. These stones feature repeating motifs that are common to the whole area of Pictish inscriptions, so they seem to belong to some kind of standardized pictorial, vocabulary, or formulary, but nobody knows what they represent. Modern scholars have given these symbols names such as the double disc and the Z-rod, but they don't really know what they represent. The really weird one is the so-called Pictish beast. It doesn't seem to represent any known animal. It looks a little like a seahorse or possibly a dolphin, but it's hard to tell. Some people have even proposed that it depicts the Loch Ness Monster. Scholars are working on these images even as we speak, so we can stay tuned for further developments. For now, though, we can say that with the exception of the Pictish beast, the Picts are less mysterious than we used to think. They grew out of the same political and cultural developments as we see in the rest of Britain. They are not some weird remnant of a pre-Celtic past. They are as much Celts as anyone else in Britain, which is to say, they're definitely speaking a Celtic language, though nobody is calling them Celts at the time. So I said that the Picts were a success story. How so? Well, the Picts seem to have gotten their act together and created a fairly stable, unified kingdom, which was always quite an achievement in this period. Starting in the period around the fall of Rome, several Pictish kingdoms emerged, primarily in northern and eastern Scotland. And a 10th century document called the Pictish Chronicle says that there were 7 of these kingdoms, each ruled by one of the 7 sons of a single king. This is suspiciously cut and dried, but it does express the reality that the Picts were slowly cohering. And by the 7th century, the most powerful Pictish kingdom, the Kingdom of Fortru in northeastern Scotland, probably exercised a kind of hegemony over the smaller Pictish territories. But the Picts were also very open to outside influences. They apparently patronized Irish-speaking bards. which foreshadows the ultimate replacement of Pictish language and culture by Irish in the years to come. But for now, I think the takeaway from this exploration of northern Britain is that the later Kingdom of Scotland is probably the most diverse in origin of any of the so-called Celtic regions. It develops out of a mixture of British and Pictish and Irish and English elements. And we'll see later that Scotland gets even more multi-ethnic in the Viking period when we add people from Scandinavia into the mix. Thank you for walking these ancient paths with us tonight. If you're still awake, don't forget to subscribe, like, and share this video so we can keep creating quiet stories for curious minds. Rest well, and remember there's always more. History waiting just beyond the horizon. This has been the Sleepless Historian. Good night.